Story 1. I was young when I first heard about the basket. I was only 18 then, and I had already begun to understand that there were things in life that could change everything. It was not something I could dream about at that time, like everyone dreams about simple things, happiness, love, and wealth. No, the basket was not part of that world. It was something more than the most desirable and impossible. It was a force that had the ability to protect, preserve, and, to some extent, stop time. I don't know who first heard of its power, but we all quickly learned anyway. The basket became the talk of every corner of the country, filling every corner of our hearts. But it wasn't just something you could buy or find. No, it was a relic, a gift from the universe or ancient forces, and its existence seemed to be a complete mystery. At first, people spoke of it with respect, but as often happens, they quickly forgot. After all, what could be in one small basket? So in passing, rumors spread that it could protect things, preventing them from being damaged. Not to damage, not to break, not to tear. It would seem, what could be important in such an ability? After all, everyone could process, change, or simply restore things. A strange relic, it would seem, for something completely insignificant. But it turned out that this basket was not so insignificant. It was not an object for ordinary people. It would only become important to those who truly understood the value of something that cannot be destroyed or destroyed. For a mother, she always wants to protect her children. She sees her role as protecting them from all the dangers of this world, and if there is a way to do it, she is ready to fight for it to the end. I understood all this when I learned that the basket can preserve not only things, but also people. This was the case with small children, and then I understood how great its power is. Many years later, I thought of her when I heard the basket being talked about in the royal palace like never before. For the queen, this artifact had become an object of great desire. Of course, she was a woman with great ambitions, and power itself demanded incredible sacrifices from her. But when she learned that this basket could protect her unborn child, she realized that nothing else mattered. Everything she had done so far was less important than ensuring the safety of her son. He was the future of her country, the future of her dynasty. He was the future of the kingdom. When she ordered the basket to be found, I knew it wouldn't be easy, and not just because it had to be found in unknown corners of the country. No, it was much more important that in order to find such a relic, something had to be sacrificed. Someone had been robbed of this basket. Someone had been robbed of their last chance of protection. The country was not ready to give up its treasures and hand them over to the queen. Many said she didn't deserve it, that she already controlled too much, had too much power, and it would surely affect the fate of her people. But her fierce determination would not let her stop. When this object was found, she did not think about the loss, for if it saved the life of her child, if it allowed him to grow up without knowing pain, fear, or death, what would it have cost her sacrifices? And that's when it became clear to me that she, as a mother, was ready for anything. She didn't look at people as equals. She saw them only as an opportunity for her own success, an opportunity to save her son's life. It was neither a good nor a bad decision. It was simply a decision made for the sake of her child. It was a desire to protect something impossible, and everyone else remained in the shadow of her goal. The basket became invisible. Like the air itself, it was always there, but unnoticed. The child was safe. He was protected from anything that could harm him. The entire life of the future heir depended on this basket never being damaged. The queen's entire power rested on her desire to keep him as he was at the moment of his birth. Soon I began to realize how much this would change her, how much it would change us all. The queen was no longer just a mother protecting her son. She was a woman asserting her power through this basket. She relied on it more and more, and the more she believed in it, the more real this magic, this protection, became. But no one noticed that it wasn't just the basket that protected her son, but that she herself was becoming part of this magical world. No danger could disturb the baby. No arrow could hurt him, and no evil could touch him. The mother looked at him with love, but she became more and more detached from reality every day. She began to see in the basket not just protection, but the meaning of everything that happened. And now I understand that the basket not only protected her son, but also became a prison. It began to isolate him from the world, protecting him not only from external threats, but also from the process of growing up itself. And this basket became a symbol of power, a symbol of immeasurable strength, but also an invisible cage. I will never forget the day the queen first learned of the basket. It was not a great event, not a rally in the council chamber, not a joyful message trumpeted from every corner. No, it was something quiet and mysterious, not revealed in the outer storm, but so powerfully reflected within her. She was sitting in her private chamber, surrounded by soft light and shadow, seeking solace after years of fighting for the throne, when she came across the very ancient scroll that tore apart the boundaries of her ideas about the future. At first she didn't believe it. The myth of the basket was old and mysterious, and people were sometimes too drawn to fantastic tales to believe in reality. But the more she thought about it, the clearer it became that the object was not just a fantasy. It existed, and now, finally, she knew where to look for it. The queen knew that her life was no longer her own. She had been born into a family whose fate had always depended on her power, on her ability to rule the land, and she had done it. With her will and her desire for control, She had held on to the crown despite every challenge she had faced, but now she faced something that could shatter even her iron grip. The fact that she was a woman and a mother put her in a different position. In this role, she felt less powerful than she had on the throne. A mother had always felt fragile, vulnerable, and this fragility was like a wound on her great body, susceptible to any blow. When she learned about the basket, I felt how everything in her changed. She became a different woman. The queen no longer thought about power, about ruling in politics. Her entire being was consumed with one thing: protecting her unborn child. She did not want to become a weak mother who loses her power because of human vulnerability. She did not want her son to become just another future king, weak and vulnerable to any blow of fate. She wanted him to be indestructible, a living embodiment of her dream of unconditional security. I remember looking at her at that moment and realizing that she no longer needed all that she had built for the kingdom. She was no longer just a queen, a ruler with will and calculation. She had become a mother, and her goal was simple: to keep her son, to keep him alive, and to give him the strength that would allow him to become strong and invincible. The basket, she learned of, was her only chance to do so. I saw the fire in her eyes, not just a desire to protect her child, but a fierce desire to achieve the impossible. The entire palace soon learned of her decision. The queen's eyelids could not close at the thought that this gift from nature could be what they were looking for. The basket could give her child a security that would be above all troubles, above any attempts to harm him. She no longer considered that the price to be paid might be high. At first, when I heard her orders, I doubted it. Send an army to find such a relic? Is it really possible to risk people's lives for one thing? I could also understand why many around her did not share her aspirations. It seemed almost insane. The country was not ready to accept such changes. In search of a magical thing that could provide protection, she was ready to sacrifice the lives of many of her subjects. There was no room for doubt in her heart. This was her child, her blood, her future. She was ready for anything. I saw her face become more determined, her gaze filled with a fire that left no room for weakness. She used every opportunity to ensure that her son would be protected. It was not just a wish, it was a commitment she made to provide him with a life without fear or pain. The army sent to search for it faced difficulties. The relic was so hidden that its location remained a secret, despite old legends and rumors. I watched as the men in armor, already having lost several of their men, continued searching despite the losses and despair. No cruel trials, no obstacles could stop them. They were under orders. It was what the queen could do to ensure the safety of her son. When the basket was delivered to the palace, I remember how it was carefully placed on the great table in the throne room, how it stood there, silently, surrounded by silence. It all seemed incredible, fantastic, as if this object was actually much more than just a basket. It was not just a thing, it was hope. It was something that could protect against all threats, that could stop time, as if the basket was not just a simple object, but the very essence of eternal protection. I saw the queen standing next to that basket, her hands shaking, but her eyes fixed on it. She was excited, but everything in her demeanor said that this was not just a mother's wish. It was a calculation. It was her idea, her plan to save her son. I saw her face, reflecting the weight of her responsibility, take on new meaning. Now that I think about that moment, I realize that everything changed from that day on. It was the moment when the queen stopped being just a woman who ruled the country. She became a mother, ready to fight for the future of her child. Once the basket was found, I thought that the rest would be a simple and selfless process. All that was left was to simply deliver it to the queen. But I was very wrong. This was only the first stage of a long and painful journey. I could not believe that such a small object as a basket could become the source of so many troubles and trials for those who would look for it. No one could have prepared for what the queen's messengers encountered. The mysterious place where the artifact was located was protected not only by nature, but also by forces not mentioned in ancient manuscripts. And if someone dared to tell the truth about the path that lay ahead for those trying to find the basket, even the queen's most loyal servants might refuse to participate in this expedition. I was among those watching from the safety of my home, but my nerves were becoming more and more tense with each passing day. The soldiers sent to search were not ordinary soldiers. They were an elite, ready to fight any threat. But they soon realized that even they could not protect themselves from the invisible dangers that lay in wait along the way. The first test was crossing an ancient forest, through which one of the shortest routes to the place where the basket was located. The forest was filled with strange creatures and visions that confused the mind. A light breeze carried scents that were not written about in books, and whispers seemed to come from other people. Rumor said that this forest was inhabited by spirits, long forgotten, dwelling in the shadows of the past. They did not make contact with those who were merely mortal, but their presence was felt in every step. When one of our men lost his mind and began to speak in an incomprehensible language we all understood, this was not just a forest. This was a territory guarded by ancient forces that were called to protect not only the basket, but also the secrets that were hidden in this place. Despite the fact that our squad was strong and prepared, with each passing hour we lost people. Some disappeared, some fell unconscious, and some said that they heard voices that beckoned them deeper into the forest. Every day we lost our people, And every day we had to move on. As much as we wanted to believe that the basket was just a thing, it was becoming something more. It was not just magic, but something that could deprive people of their minds, something that could drive them mad. Our allies began to doubt the wisdom of our decision. Some suggested turning back, believing that too many people were dying for some mythical thing. But the queen would not tolerate retreat. For her, the basket was a necessity, and even if it cost the lives of her subjects, she was ready to go to the end. The dead remained in the memory of the living, and with each new step, everything became more difficult and disturbing. We walked through mountains across a river where the water was so cold that our hands froze on the spot. Along the way, we met tribes who had a sacred right to guard the territory through which we moved. They watched our every step, and our every gesture could be interpreted as a threat. Clashes with them became inevitable, and in each battle we lost even more people. Our troops melted away. But the worst thing was that the basket was becoming not just a goal, but something we could not leave behind. It was no longer just a mystery, a myth. It was something that demanded our sacrifice. With every step, with every day, we lost something important. Not only people, but feelings. We became different, and some of us began to doubt our cause. Those who had survived so far felt empty. When we finally got to the place where the basket was, I realized that we had been chasing more than just an artifact for too long. We had been chasing something that had become an idea, a symbol, a curse. Here, in this corner of the world, where everything connected to the past was forgotten, we finally found it. Branches, bushes, stones, and there, in the middle of this wilderness, like a reflection of light, stood the basket. I would be lying if I said I didn't feel relief when it was in our hands, but it wasn't a triumph. It was a defeat. We had found what we were looking for, but we were left with something we had lost along the way. It wasn't something to be happy about, but a weight on our shoulders. I thought our journey would be complete, that we would be able to return home with this relic and give it to the queen. But we knew that our story wasn't over with this basket. The magic of this thing wasn't just in finding it, it was its power, its mysterious essence, that affected us even before we had it. We all believed in our victory, but it seemed to me now that it was falling upon us like a curse. We didn't realize that the encounter with this ancient, powerful artifact was just beginning. The queen would get her basket, but she would no longer get what she was prepared to receive. The queen did not receive the basket as I expected, and I did not know what to expect. We returned to the capital, and the air in the city was filled with celebration. People gathered in the streets, celebrating the return of the envoys, but I did not feel joy. I could not help but think that this object for which we had sacrificed so much had already changed something in us. It was too heavy to be simply carried and handed to the queen. It was not simply an object to be placed in her chambers as a symbol of victory. When I finally set the basket down before the queen, the first saw her gaze change instantly. It wasn't surprise so much as recognition that she was no longer the woman she had once been. I could see it in her eyes, the glint in their eyes, full of determination but also some inner confusion. She was now facing something she couldn't fully understand, even if she wanted to. I knew she wasn't just looking for safety for her son, not just a way to protect him from the world. She was looking for a way to strengthen him, to make him strong, invulnerable. But something about that basket was so powerful and so incomprehensible that it could turn against her. The basket was small. It didn't seem scary, but its shape, its gentle curves, and the weave of the fabric left a strange feeling that it actually had some kind of shadow. I can't explain exactly what it was that bothered me, but something inside me told me that this object was too deep and beyond simple human understanding. The queen stood there, hesitant to touch it, as if afraid to touch something that might change it. I remember her fingers just brushing the surface, and that was it. It was like a premonition of something much greater than just a material thing, a mother and her child. So she thought, so she hoped, but what seemed so simple and obvious turned out to be much more complicated. The moment she lightly touched the basket, I felt something hang in the air. It was like a jolt in the shadows, like a gentle wave that barely touched the water but then stayed there, making everything sway. No miracle could have prepared her for what happened next. The baby, who was still safely inside the basket, was truly indestructible, and his mother had no doubt about it. But I saw how even the queen began to doubt that her visions and dreams of endless protection could be realized. She, like everyone else, believed that the basket would keep her child safe, that it would be an invisible shield that would not allow even the slightest harm. But this encounter with reality, with the very nature of the basket, showed that it could no longer be just a shield. It had become something alive, something that led people, that did not leave them alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stood in my room, watching the queen, who was still sitting next to the basket. She wasn't looking at me. She wasn't looking at anything. She just sat there, as if waiting. And I couldn't figure out what she was waiting for. That object couldn't just disappear from her life. I knew that the basket had taken more from her than just her confidence in the future. It seemed that with each passing moment she became more distant, as if the world around her was disappearing. It wasn't just a feeling. It was something that permeated her, her soul, and perhaps her son himself. I saw her hands begin to shake, her heart begin to beat faster. And in that moment I understood. The queen was ready to sacrifice everything to keep her child safe, but now she was ready to pay a much greater price, than she thought. But the basket did more than guard her son. It stirred such a storm of emotion in the queen, such a strange mixture of fear and curiosity, that she was no longer the same woman she had been before. It was more than magic. It was an intervention in her very being. I saw her eyes become glassy. She began to lose track of time, as if everything around her became distant and alien. The basket was not just an object that provided protection. It was something that even those who sought it did not understand. It became something that controlled their thoughts, made them doubt their actions. I could not shake the feeling that it was changing people, that it was consuming them, forcing them to move towards some new, unknown, but very dangerous path. The queen could no longer be sure that everything she had done was right. Every day her inner state became more and more precarious, and although she tried to control the situation, I saw how this force inside the basket was gradually taking her away from reality. Fear appeared in her eyes, which could not be hidden behind the outer calm. Now I knew that not only her son, but the queen herself was a part of all this. And the more she sought to ensure the safety of her child, the deeper she plunged into a world where there was no room for simple solutions. I stood there, watching, and couldn't help but think that the basket was no longer just an object. It was a symbol of the fact that they were now part of something much more destructive. In those days, when I first saw the queen leading her son in a basket through the corridors of the palace, everyone around us began to sense changes. At first they were almost imperceptible, a slight tremor in the air, strange shadows flickering on the walls, a silence that came suddenly after noisy conversations. More and more often I met the worried glances of servants, who exchanged quick glances, as if they all knew that we were standing on the edge of something, but no one dared to speak of it out loud. The queen carried the basket with great care, and her son continued to grow, or at least he should have. But something was wrong. He had not changed. He was still the same little baby he had been on the day he was born, when he had first been placed in that wonderful but strange basket. Even his eyes, they were the same as when he had first begun his life, dark, piercing, as if he knew more than should be possible for such a small creature. He looked at the world, but his gaze was not truly childish, like other children. It was the gaze of one who was connected to something more powerful and perhaps dangerous than this world could understand. Tension grew in the castle with each passing day. The queen, despite her steadfastness, became increasingly irritated and even agitated. She checked the basket, stood next to it for hours, but could not understand why her son did not change. She led him through the palace halls, allowing him to sit in the basket, which, according to her belief, was supposed to protect him. But was she protecting him from this world? I could not help but notice how her behavior became more and more strange. Everyone around us started wondering what happened. Why wasn't the boy aging, growing, developing? At first we were all amazed, but soon we realized that this wasn't just a growth retardation. It was something more. The boy seemed unable to grow. He was stuck in his little body, as if time had stopped for him. The queen desperately tried to find answers. She turned to sages, to elders, to ancient books, hoping that some answer would be found, but it was all useless. Every study, every experiment, every approach to the solution led to the same result. The boy remained as small as the day he was born, and no one could understand what was happening. One night, as we sat in the hall, surrounded by the shadows of the candles, I noticed that the queen looked especially tired. Her face had lost its former calm. She seemed clouded. Her eyes, so bright and determined before, were now clouded with something I could not understand. She sat by the window, holding a basket on her lap, and looked out into the darkness. I approached to speak to her, but before I could say anything, she turned to me. "You see it?" Her voice was shaky, almost a whisper. "He doesn't age. He doesn't change. I can't understand why." I couldn't answer. I had no answers. In her eyes, I could see the darkness and doubt filling her soul. Once she had been determined, strong, confident, and now she was darkened, consumed by something we all couldn't understand. We couldn't understand what the basket was doing to her son, and perhaps that was the scariest part. We didn't understand its power, its impact, its influence. All this time we sought protection, confident that the basket would provide it. But as the days turned to weeks, and the weeks to months, it became obvious that we were wrong. The boy wasn't growing. He wasn't getting older. He wasn't developing. He was stuck in his body. And that wasn't just weird, it was dangerous. Because now I was beginning to realize that what we thought was a blessing could be a curse. The queen remained tied to the basket, turning her attention to it more and more, as if waiting for everything to get better. But I knew there was nothing that could bring her son back to normal. The longer she remained in this state, the more it seemed to me that the basket was not protection, but a link between her son and something we could not understand. It was not just an object, it was something that eclipsed everything around it. Eventually, I realized that no one could control what it would do to us. This basket, this artifact, was not just a magical object, it was more, and it was dangerous. Every day, as I looked at the queen and her son, I saw their lives change. She couldn't let him out of her care. She couldn't let him out of that basket because she was afraid that without her, he would disappear, that he would leave her. She was tied to him, and he was tied to that basket. It was a strange and painful connection, and I knew that perhaps we were all part of something much bigger than just finding protection for her son. And with each passing day, I began to understand that if the queen did not stop, if she did not stop believing that this basket would bring her happiness, Then she could lose much more than she could ever imagine. Silence reigned in the castle, and though we all went on with our lives, each day there was an indescribable weight. The sky had turned gray, as if it felt the same anxiety as all of us. Only one shadow still moved through the corridors, her footsteps keeping pace. It was the queen. Not only was she physically close to her son, but she was completely absorbed in him. I could not take my eyes off her, seeing her change each day, how she retreated further from reality, deeper into a world where only she and her son existed. With each passing month, with each passing day, it became clear that the basket was not a solution. It was not a salvation. On the contrary, it seemed to be dragging them into an eternal circle, where there was no beginning and no end. The boy did not age. He did not evolve. His eyes remained unchanged, his face infinitely young, despite the passing of time. Unlike everything around him, time did not touch him. It stood, retreating before the magic that fettered his body, his soul. His body was stuck, but for some reason, instead of growing, it became more and more empty. I noticed this, but I did not know how to explain it. What had once seemed a miracle now became something much more sinister. The queen, who had no other goal than to protect her son, began to suffer from her own illusions. All her hopes that the basket would keep him safe had already lost all justification. On her face, in her gestures, not only determination but also despair increasingly appeared. She knew that this object did not solve her problem. It did not make her son healthy. It did not give him a normal life, but she still could not stop believing in it. One day I approached her as she sat in the shadows by the window holding a basket in her lap. This moment was different. Something in her eyes had changed. She no longer looked at her son with the same maternal love she had before. She looked at him as an object, as something she could not control, something that could slip away at any moment. It was an anxious, almost empty expression. "It's not growing," she said quietly, as if it were something she was realizing for the first time. "Why isn't it growing?" I was silent, because I didn't know the answer either. Many times I tried to explain to her that the basket couldn't be what she needed, but she didn't listen. I knew that she needed more than just protection for her son, but the meaning she had been searching for all this time. She believed in this basket as a magical talisman, as something that could give her hope for the future, for her son's happiness. But I saw how this belief was destroying her, and the destructive process was not only external but also internal. She was losing her confidence, her strength, her very essence. I began to understand that she was missing something much deeper. This basket was not enough to fix the mistake she had made. We were all living in this labyrinth, and she was trapped inside its walls. Those who still dared to voice their doubts began to notice that the boy was not aging. They noticed how his eyes were as young as the day he was born, and although the queen desperately tried to convince herself that this was temporary, that everything would get better, every day she felt more and more that this was not just one of her many fears. This was reality. The boy was stuck, no matter how hard she tried. He could not continue to grow in the basket. Time passed by, leaving only disappointment. We all began to notice that his lack of maturation was not just a physical phenomenon. There was something strange, unnatural about his gaze. He could not grow because he could not experience any of the changes that all living things go through. He was locked in a state in which he could not experience pain, joy, or growth. He was like a frozen painting, unable to move. The queen couldn't comprehend it. Every time someone tried to talk to her about it, she dismissed their words as if they were empty. She said she had time, that her son would grow up, that everything would work out. But something inside me said that if she didn't accept this reality, she herself would become part of this frozen time. In the night hours, I often heard her footsteps as she tried to understand what had happened, what she had done wrong. She would lift the basket, listen to the silence, and seem to be in some incredible trance, as if she was looking for answers where there were none. I tried to approach her to offer help, but she pushed me away. She was alone with this curse. It was a heavy burden that even her closest friend could not share. Slowly, I realized we had all become part of this sinister process. This basket had taken not only the queen's son, but her as well. We had all become dependent on this magical object, on the illusion of security it brought. We were all stuck in this moment in time, just like the boy. Everything around us was becoming empty, like stasis. We were unable to move forward, no matter how hard we tried. But I still hoped. Sometimes I thought that somewhere there was a way to return everything to normal, to return the growth, to return the changes. And although I did not know what was happening to the boy, I understood that the answer was hidden somewhere deeper. And perhaps in order to understand it, it was necessary to free oneself from this belief, from this basket. But the queen could not understand it. She could not let go of her dream. All that remained of the queen was her image, her gaze, which became more and more frightening with each passing day. She was no longer the strong and confident woman who had once ruled the land with wisdom and determination. She had become a shadow of herself, tormented by fear for her son and the eternal struggle with something she could not understand. This battle with the unknown had brought her to a point where there was no movement, no light. The queen no longer dealt with her advisors. Her mind became clouded, and all she saw was her son and that damned basket. Every day she sat next to him, unable to tear herself away, unable to let go. The basket itself had become for her not just a symbol of salvation, but a symbol of her own failure. But she could not admit it, and so, not knowing how to escape this trap, the queen sank deeper and deeper into her world, a world that was not real. I couldn't watch this any longer. My heart couldn't take it anymore. I tried to find answers, but my attempts were met with her desperate belief that only the basket could help. I often went to her, offered her different solutions, but she was mute. She didn't hear. Her attention was focused only on her son, on this restless, still infant creature that did not change. And so, on one of those hopeless days, when the queen, unable to bear her despair, was left alone in her room, I went to her. Her gaze was empty, lifeless. She looked at her son, and his eyes, as always, were full of the same silent, unchanging anxiety. And then I realized that if I did not tell her the truth now, if I did not tell her what I had learned myself, we would all remain in this vicious circle forever. But you have to let him go, I said, looking into her eyes. You have to understand that by keeping him in that basket, you're not giving him a chance. You're not giving him a chance to grow, to change, to become a person. You're holding him captive, just like you were holding yourself captive. She looked at me, and there was something in her eyes that I couldn't immediately place. It was something I'd seen in her many times before, a horror of reality, an unwillingness to admit that her decision was wrong. But this time, her eyes weren't like they always were. They were empty, but there was a sparkle in them, as if she finally realized that the truth was right there, in front of her. I can't let him go, she whispered, almost as an excuse. I can't lose him. But you've already lost him, I answered quietly. You lost him because you wouldn't let him grow. You lost him because you wouldn't let him become who he was meant to be. She was silent for a long moment, and then she carefully lifted the basket with her son in it. I saw her take a deep breath, as if in that moment everything in her was resisting the release of what she had been holding on to for so long. And in that moment I knew that if she could, she would do anything to get her son back the way he was before the basket came into their lives. But there was no turning back in her decision. The queen stood on the brink, and all she had left was a choice. A sparkle appeared in her eyes again, perhaps a faint hope that she could do what had to be done. But this choice was terrible. Letting go of it was painful. It meant admitting that everything she believed in was an illusion. It meant admitting that the magic of the basket had not saved her, but had only frozen time, preventing her and her son from moving forward. For a minute, maybe two, she hesitated, standing there, holding the basket in her hands, as if trying to process what she had to do. And then, as if finally realizing the hopelessness of her situation, she carefully set the basket down on the table. She couldn't quite let go of it, but at least she had taken a step toward liberation. It was the first step toward disillusionment, the first step toward reclaiming her life. The boy in the basket was still small, but at that moment, though he remained immature, there was something new about him, something I couldn't immediately explain. It was as if the very air around him had changed, as if his very soul had been given the chance to evolve, even if his body showed no change. It was the beginning of change. Even though he was out of sight, I could feel something changing, like a small step, like a break in endless time. The queen took another step back and finally allowed herself to look at the world beyond her small room, beyond the basket. It was scary because it meant she had accepted defeat, but it was also liberating. And in her eyes, at last, I saw something that was not fear. I saw that she was a queen again, not because her son had changed, but because she herself was beginning to free herself from her fear and her illusions. In that moment, I realized that even the darkest moments can be overcome if we find the strength to let go of what is holding us back. And although there was no guarantee that things would get better, I knew one thing: this was the only way to take back my life. Story 2. I stood in front of the door of an employment agency, hidden in the back of town between a grocery store and a haberdashery. Heavy graffiti on the walls, a small sign that was hard to spot even if you knew where to look, fingerprints on the glass, and a dim light that barely filtered through the dusty windows. I walked closer, smelling old newspapers and the oil from the poor gears that seemed to have been turning in this place since the last time I was here. I can't remember when that was though. Maybe a week, maybe a month, it didn't matter. Time didn't seem to matter here. I walked in. It had always been like this here. The same room, the same plastic chairs along the walls, the same expectations. There was a sense of disappointment and hopelessness in the air, like dust that hadn't been wiped off in a long time. People like me were sitting around. People who had given up hope but still showed up. You had to show up if you didn't want to lose your unemployment benefits. So there I was. I didn't expect to find a job. I wasn't in the mood to look. I just had to be here to get the next benefit. To come in every now and then and sit silently. To be told that your situation wouldn't improve until you found a job. But finding a job was impossible, and everyone knew it. I looked around the room. To the left, someone was struggling with a phone, like they were just learning how to use it, trying to get through to someone who could help them. To the right, a woman was sitting, very nervous, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. She was clutching a resume, and I knew it was the last thing she was holding on to, like a life preserver that no one believed in. I even felt a little bad for her. These people were like zombies. They knew they weren't going to get anywhere, but they kept going. I wasn't different. I was a zombie too. When I finally got to the table, I didn't say anything. Rachel stood in front of me with a pile of papers and a blank stare. Her suit was bright lime green, which made her stand out, sure, but against the gray, dull walls and decor, she looked almost ridiculous. She looked like she'd just stepped off the runway, with that smile of hers that was trying to hide her irritation but failing miserably. She looked at me as if I was just another candidate who wasn't worth anything. And I was that candidate. I didn't feel like talking. I was used to these interviews. I knew how it worked. They ask questions, you answer, and then you leave. And they probably don't even remember your name. I gave them my name, address, and social security number, and that was enough to get them to move on. I wasn't going to go into too much detail. I didn't want to give them information they didn't need. My past didn't matter to them. The military, college, it was all a long time ago, and frankly, I didn't know why I even bothered talking about it. Rachel sat across from me, her fingers skimming the paper as if she were trying to find something important among the resumes. At first, I didn't think she was really listening, but then her eyes landed on me, and I realized she was paying attention. She took a quick look at me, probably not thinking about me but about what was coming next. Her eyes grew serious, looking at me like I was someone who had just ruined all of my chances. I knew what was coming next. She would tell me my resume wasn't right. She would tell me I was too uneducated, that I didn't have the skills. I knew it like I knew there would be rain in the sky. I was bored. I didn't want to hear her reasons. I knew she already knew I wasn't right for the job. I knew I wasn't right for anything. I wasn't looking for a job. I didn't want to work. It was a drag, and I didn't see the point. All I wanted was to sit at home, get paid, and not think about what made me who I was. And no matter how hard I tried to hide it, I knew Rachel would notice. She was smart, and so were all these people who worked here. It was like they all knew we weren't here to make anything of ourselves. We were all here to keep our benefits, and I was one of them. She shook her head and jotted down a few notes. I didn't know what she'd written, but I could have guessed. I was a loser. I wasn't special. I was just another person they were wasting their time with. But that was part of the game. We were all playing this game here. I sat with my arms crossed and tried not to look at her suit, at her face, at her eyes that were trying to be kind even though she already knew how this was going to end. When she finished writing, I stood up, picked up my bag, and walked out without a word. The world outside was the same as before, gray, dull, meaningless. But I didn't need anything else. I knew I had 2 weeks. I knew I'd come back again, and I'd see Rachel again in her bright lime green suit, and that was all I could hope for. With each step, I realized more and more that this game would never end. We would all go around in circles until we were completely frustrated, and then we would just stop trying. It's been a couple of days since I visited the agency again. To be honest, I was glad I hadn't returned earlier. Yesterday was another reminder of how stuck I am in this endless loop of unemployment. All my attempts to find a job have been, to put it mildly, complete failures. Well, what am I supposed to do if all I want is to just collect benefits and avoid unnecessary efforts? When I walked into the agency again, I knew it would be the same. The same plastic chairs, the same smell of old advertising flyers, and probably the same people who couldn't decide whether to be there or stay home. They were just sitting and waiting, just like me. My mind was on everything but the job search, all those interviews, and trying to come across as someone who was up for the challenge. It was all so damn exhausting. I never understood why they insisted on you looking professional when the process itself had nothing to do with the actual work. Why should I fit into their system? Why can't I just be myself? I knew that no one was waiting for me at this agency anyway. Rachel greeted me as usual with the same cold stare I knew by now. She didn't even try to hide her irritation. I could sympathize with her if she weren't so smug. Rachel wasn't here to help people find jobs. She was here to make money. She had neither the time nor the inclination to prioritize anyone's needs but her own. She had probably lost count of the number of candidates she had eliminated this month, and all of them were just like me, and all of them, like me, couldn't change anything. We were all just coming here to confirm that we had wasted a little more time. She didn't say much when I sat down in front of her again. Her words sounded like a simple formality. A few standard questions, a few notes in a notebook, everything according to the script, everything as usual. I listened to her, but my mind was elsewhere. Oh, how I wished I could just tell her that I didn't need this stupid interview, that I didn't need the job. I had long ago realized that trying to please these people was useless. I knew she didn't believe I could be more than just another candidate on the list. Then again, I didn't believe it myself. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was all some big game that no one was winning. Why did I even come here if I didn't have to work? Why did I worry so much if all my efforts ended up being empty promises? Rachel seemed so confident in her role, so sure of herself, so superior to the rest of us, all of these people who somehow couldn't find their way in this world. She sat in her seat, her laugh as fake as her suit, lime green. How ironic. The only thing that made her stand out was that she was trying to hide her frustration with her flamboyant exterior. She was part of a system that, like everyone else, profited from people who couldn't find themselves. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the way she continued to write in her notebook. She was making quick notes, and it was clear she wasn't looking for anything valuable in my resume. She probably didn't even plan to read it. Her job was simple: fill a quota, get people through the process. What happened next was secondary. No matter how much she tried to make it seem like she was helping people, I knew she wasn't. We were all just doing our part in this silly theater. Rachel kept writing, and it all repeated itself like an old record. The faces of the people waiting for their interviews changed, but the process remained the same. We arrived, sat, listened, said a few words, and left unchanged. I no longer expected anything to change. I wondered how many more people like me would walk through those doors. I didn't know how to answer her questions. I didn't want to give honest answers. I already knew the same words would follow. You should try changing your approach. At some point, I just stopped. And here she was again, just like the last time, telling me that my resume wasn't right. It wasn't unexpected. Honestly, I knew it was a waste of time. My lack of experience, education, and skills didn't match their ideal. It was as obvious as the fact that I was still sitting here. When I stood up to leave, I didn't feel bitter. I didn't feel disappointed anymore. It was just empty. Nothing. I just went back to what I came with. But this time I decided I wouldn't come back here anymore. No, I'll still come back. And maybe next time I'll listen to the same thing again. We all come back because there's no other choice. I even felt a little sad for Rachel. She was part of this world, as empty and confusing as I was. In the end, she was a prisoner too. She tried to seem strong, but in reality, she had no choice. We are all playing the same game. A few days passed, and I found myself standing in front of that door again, reluctantly stepping into the employment agency. There was a weariness in the air, as if everything that happened here was mundane and unremarkable, but at the same time unbearably repetitive. However, all I knew about myself at that moment boiled down to one simple thought. I was just another person in line here. As much as I tried to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't shake the feeling that this place was a trap for me. Maybe that was the whole point of this agency, to keep people in this loop where they were supposed to believe they needed a job, but in reality, none of it mattered. People came in, filled out forms, had interviews, and left, leaving the same trail behind them, a trail that was unchanged. And here I was again. It was like this had become my ritual, my routine, my way of existing in this world, not taking any steps forward, just continuing to move in a loop that led nowhere. When I walked into the agency, it was the same as always: drab plastic chairs, carelessly strewn flyers, and murky lighting, like an old movie where people had lost all hope and weren't trying to be anyone anymore. The place was just like me, hidden behind a wall I'd built. I didn't expect anything. I knew the results would be the same as always, a waste of time and no real purpose. This whole game, this process I knew so well, seemed pointless, but I kept going anyway. I sat down on one of the chairs, staring into the dusty air that hung in the room. All these people waiting for their turn were just like me, listening to someone nearby move papers, to doors opening and closing. I suddenly felt like an outsider in this space. Maybe they were part of this game too, but at least their expectations were real. They believed that they could change their lives. I didn't believe. I had long ago realized that my life had become a set of routine actions that were repeated day after day, and there was no escape from it. The process was painfully familiar. It seemed like nothing had changed, and everything was going along as usual. Once again, I had to return to this endless cycle, to this empty ritual. I always tried to look confident, as if I needed it. But inside, I knew that I had no confidence and never would. And what's even stranger is that it didn't even make me nervous. I was just used to it. The people I interacted with here were part of the same process, part of a chain that repeated itself without changing anything. Rachel's gaze was the same, and her face expressed nothing but indifference and fatigue. She did her job, and that was it. There was no room for genuine feelings in this room. There were no people here who were looking for meaning in what they were doing. Here, everyone was simply fulfilling their roles, and no one was asking what they really wanted. The interview process was empty and pointless. Rachel quickly filled out the forms, wrote down a few unimportant things, and that was it. As always, her gaze didn't change, and I knew I wouldn't find anything new here. My unemployment status hadn't changed, and it probably wouldn't change for a long time, but something about that moment caught me. Maybe I sensed something more in her gaze, some brief, subtle reflection in her eyes. Maybe she felt caught in this cycle, too, like I did, but I couldn't be sure. We both sat in our roles, going through the motions, not knowing where they would lead us. I stood up again and headed for the exit, ready to return to my daily routine. But something inside me suddenly clicked. I realized that this moment had become a turning point for me. I couldn't just continue as usual. I couldn't pretend that everything was normal, that I didn't care. I knew that it wasn't so, but I also knew I wasn't ready for change right now. I just walked away without looking back, feeling like the darkness that had enveloped me was still with me. All I wanted was to find some way out of it, but I didn't know how. I found myself on the street again, and this world seemed strange and incomprehensible to me again. Looking up at the sky gave me no answer. I still didn't know what to do next, but at least now I felt that something in my life could change. True, I still didn't know what exactly. I stood at the door of the agency and watched the world around me continue to move at its usual pace. People rushed about their business, cars sped along the streets, and I was outside of it all. An eclipse. A pause. I couldn't figure out what to do next. Understanding that I was stuck in this life was easy. Accepting it was much harder. This moment, standing on the threshold of timelessness, felt like a small death, as if I could actually be outside of all this movement, outside of all the obligations and routines that seemed to guarantee a normal life. More and more, I realized that the world I lived in was not my own. I was just an outside observer, and as much as I wanted to look for excuses for this, as much as I wanted to blame circumstances, one thing was clear: I was trapped in a trap of my own making. It was I who had created this barrier, and now I was trapped within its walls, not knowing how to get out. I realized that I didn't want to go back to this agency, but what else could I do? I couldn't go back to my empty apartment. I couldn't stay with this feeling of emptiness that seemed to thicken with every step. I decided to move on, somewhere where it would be easier for me to breathe, easier to think. Just get away from this place, from all of this. At that moment, it became clear to me that I had long since lost myself, but I didn't know how to get back. I was constantly clinging to trivialities, to empty actions, hoping that they would lead me to something real, but in reality, all this was just a distraction from what was bothering me. I was trying to squeeze myself into a framework that someone imposed on me, but perhaps I was too stubborn to admit that these frameworks were not for me. My steps became more and more determined as I walked down the street, ignoring the passers-by who seemed not to notice me. Every day in this city, in this world, was like the previous one, and I felt like there was a gap between us that was impossible to cross. And yet, I needed to find at least some crack in this world where I could start something new. Maybe it was stupid. Maybe it would be another madness, but now I couldn't stop. I understood that I had no other choice. I couldn't stay in this state any longer. An hour passed. 2. I found myself in a park where the air was fresher and new growth was beginning to emerge from the trees. It was strange, because despite all these signs of life, I still didn't feel alive. I looked at people walking with children, at couples holding hands, and I realized that I was just like them. They were walking, moving forward, and I stood, standing still, watching. I couldn't figure out why this place made me feel this way. Was it regret, a sense of missing out on something important? But it was clear to me that this was all part of a larger process. I felt like everything around me was moving, but I was still here, stuck in the past, stuck in my thoughts and my regrets. Suddenly, a group of teenagers approached me, laughing and talking loudly. Their voices were sharp and bright, and though I tried to turn away and continue watching the trees, their conversation soon infiltrated my thoughts. They discussed how they wanted to escape their boring lives, how tired they were of the routine. Their words echoed in my head, and I realized that they were looking for the same thing I was, a way out. At that moment, I realized that I was not alone. I was not the first or the last person to ask these questions. These teenagers, like me, were searching for their own path, searching for a way out of what had become a cage for them. Their lives were full of limitations, but they still kept moving. Maybe it was this movement that was important. Maybe that was the whole point, not to dwell on what seems impossible, but to keep looking. I stood up and decided to take a walk through the park. But unlike those first steps I took, with each step I felt something inside me begin to change. It wasn't an instant revelation. It wasn't a realization that I knew what to do. But at least for a moment, I felt like I wasn't stuck. I wasn't a prisoner of my past. I wasn't a hostage of my thoughts. It would be an exaggeration to say that I had decided to change anything in my life, but I knew I had to keep moving. It might have been a small step, but it was a step that was leading me to something new, even though I didn't yet know what that would be. Time kept going, and maybe that was the whole point, to keep moving, no matter what, no matter how hard it might be. And I finally realized that the most important step I needed to take was not to stop. Every day was the same for me, but today there was something different in the air. I don't know what exactly changed, but when I woke up this morning and looked out the window, the whole world seemed a little more real. I felt it somewhere deep down, as if some invisible force was pushing me, and I suddenly realized that I couldn't go on like this. I didn't know what was waiting for me, but I knew that I couldn't stay in this endless repetition any longer. I knew that this day would be different, and maybe only today would I start looking for answers. I felt strangely refreshed as I rose from my bed, despite a sleepless night of tossing and turning in my thoughts, fighting with myself. For a long time, I had lived in what might be called an inner eclipse, locked in my thoughts, my worries and regrets. I had not allowed myself to move forward, to see anything new, but today was different. I stepped outside and felt the cool air fill my lungs, illuminating every corner of my mind. Everything that had happened before this moment seemed less important. That day, I decided to return to the agency, not because I hoped to find work again. No, that would be too simple an explanation. I simply knew that I had to face this place again, to see it without illusions, to look at it as something that had no power over me. This act of return was more of a challenge to myself than an attempt to find any new direction in my life. When I walked into the agency, I didn't feel any fear, any of the apathy that had always hung over me before. It was a sense of liberation that I couldn't explain in words. Everything around me was the same as before, the same chairs, the same smell of paper, the same hushed conversations behind the door. But now I saw it differently. I saw that this place couldn't control me anymore, that I didn't have to be just another person in this system. Rachel greeted me with the same indifference she always did. She looked a little tired, as always, but there was something in her eyes I hadn't noticed before. Maybe it was tiredness, or maybe it was something more. No matter, I thought. I was ready to challenge this system, and maybe I wasn't ready for what I might find. We sat down across from each other, and I felt the tension in the room dissipate. It wasn't what I expected, but it was exactly what I needed, to let go of the pressure, to let go of this mask I'd been wearing all this time. I sat there not as someone looking for a job, but as someone looking for something much more important. I was looking for an opportunity for change. It all became clearer in the conversations I had with Rachel. She was talking about a job opening that might be right for me, but instead of listening to her words, I began to realize that I didn't really care where I worked. What was I looking for? Not a job. I was looking for myself. looking for a way out of the place I'd been in for so long. Rachel was talking about opportunities and possibilities, but I heard it as background noise, like noise that didn't noise. I wasn't part of that world anymore, not part of the process that had always kept me in place. I felt something changing inside me. It was strange, but not scary. I began to understand that I would no longer make excuses. I would not wait for someone to decide for me what to do. I would decide for myself. Yes, it was scary, because there were no guarantees ahead, but at the same time I realized that I wanted to move, not stay in one place. When I left the agency, I didn't feel the same despondency I had before. It was a different feeling. Not confidence, but the certainty that I no longer wanted to be part of this game. I was ready to find something of my own, not relying on someone else's solutions, not clinging to standard paths. It was a liberation from what had bound me for so long. On the street, I no longer cared how people looked at me. I didn't care what would happen next, because I was on the threshold of something new. I didn't know where to go, but I knew one thing: I didn't have to stay where I was. All this time, I was attached to a place, to people, to duties that didn't really matter to me. And so, here I was again, on the brink of change, ready to move towards something new. I didn't know what, but I knew I had to put all doubts aside and take action. This wasn't just a decision, it was my first step toward freedom. Every step I took felt difficult, as if there were needles growing under my nails, but at the same time there was a strange lightness that had not been there before. I realized that I had become more determined. There was fear, of course, it had always been there, but I knew that everything was different now. No matter how hard I tried to close my eyes to reality, I could no longer go back. I had left the point where I had remained safe, and now, despite all the doubts, I continued to move forward. Melbourne, the city I found myself in, was completely alien and yet inviting. I didn't know what to expect from it. What would happen if I just went somewhere I hadn't been before? Dreams and expectations kept creeping into my head, but I kept them in check. Now I was ready to leave those dreams behind and just see things as they were. I found myself on the street again. The place that had seemed gray and lifeless before was now filled with some meaning. Everything around me had changed. I even began to feel different, as if with each step something old, something unnecessary was being torn away. I realized that this change was not just in what was happening around me, but also inside me. I have always been against routine work, against repetitive steps that do not give anything new. But the more I thought about it, the more I understood that over the years of living in this endless cycle, I myself had become part of this routine. I was no better than others. All these years I complained that the world did not give me a chance, but I did not ask myself what exactly I was doing to change my life. But now it was all clear. I was ready to let go. Yes, it was scary. Scary because I knew there was no guarantee ahead. I stood at the edge of the abyss, staring into the fog with no clear idea of what was around the next corner. And yet I knew I had no choice. I couldn't go back to the cage I'd created. Melbourne, as if it had come to life, continued to blur my sense of normal life. People went about their business, but I did not. I stood there and felt as if I were in the middle of a film, where the hero is about to make a decisive choice. There was something liberating in admitting that I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't need perfect plans, I didn't need certainty. The main thing was to move forward. I walked the streets without thinking about where I was going. It was a release from all the obligations, from all the worries that once kept me walking the same paths. I knew I needed to change something in my life, but now I understood that it would not be instantaneous. Change does not happen that quickly, but it certainly happens if you do not stand still. I could continue to complain that nothing is happening, or I could create the change myself. Along the way, I saw familiar faces. People who were once my colleagues, friends, acquaintances, now they seemed so alien. I realized that this world they lived in was not my world. We are all in search of something, and that something is not always what we expect. My life had been consumed by fear, fatigue, and inaction. I had always told myself that I didn't want to work for someone else, but something had kept me trapped. And now that I had finally made the decision to move, I felt like the weight had finally lifted. I might still have some tough days ahead of me, I might still make mistakes, but I knew one thing: I was no longer the same person I used to be. The street was filling with noise. Melbourne was at its usual pace, but for me it was completely new. Watching people rush about their business no longer evoked envy or irritation as it once did. I no longer felt like a stranger among them. I understood that every person, no matter what kind of life they lead, also has their own struggles. My problems were just part of the general flow, and I was now ready to be part of that flow, not from the outside, but from the inside. I walked on, without looking back. Everything that was happening around me no longer mattered. I was not looking for myself in their looks or their expectations. I was looking for myself in what I could do myself. And even if that path was not clear, I understood that the path begins with a step, and I took that step. This whole week has been strange. The days seem to stretch out, and in my soul I feel a constant anxiety that won't let go. Everything I knew about myself until now seems to be slowly losing its meaning. When you stop following the beaten path, when you break away from old habits, new horizons begin to open up, and with every step, with every new turn, I felt the old world moving away. But the closer I got to the new, the more lost I became in the unknown. I couldn't say that I liked this process, and I couldn't even say that I liked what was happening to me. Everything was sort of on the edge between what was and what was yet to appear. And on this border, In the void, I sort of existed. When I first thought about change, I imagined how everything would be clear, that I would take the first step and everything would become new, simple, clear. But in reality, it turns out that change is not bright and clear moments, but rather a constant state of uncertainty. It's like you're floating in a fog, not knowing where to go, but continuing to move forward. You can't see what's ahead, but you keep going anyway. I started seeing people I hadn't noticed before. People on the street, passersby, random conversations in cafes. Everyone seemed to be a reflection of me. I began to see my fears, my expectations, my meaninglessness in them, and it was both terrifying and liberating. All these faces, all these stories that I had previously ignored were now a part of me. It was as if I had finally seen that the world was not just a painting, but a living, breathing being with whom I was connected. One day, a few days after my last visit to the agency, I decided to drop in again, not because I needed anything from Rachel, but because I was beginning to realize that I couldn't just be an observer of my life. I couldn't stay in a position where all I did was complain and shirk responsibility. I was ready to face my own fears and doubts. When I walked into the agency, everything was the same as the first time. The same chairs, the same unpleasant smell of paper and mustiness, the same plastic tables and faceless faces. But now I saw it differently. I was ready to break out of it. I wasn't looking for a job. I was looking for something more. I was looking for an opportunity to give myself a chance at something real, something that could change my life. I walked up to the counter where Rachel was standing. I saw the weariness in her eyes, the same weariness I had been carrying around for a long time. She asked me what I wanted, but this time I didn't give her anything specific. I simply silently placed my old resume in front of her, the one she had already seen, not for her to do anything with it, but to say that I wasn't just coming here out of inertia. I came because I was ready for change, ready for what was to come, ready to go where the answers were waiting for me. We sat across from each other again. She looked at me, and there was something more than just weariness in her gaze. I didn't know what it was, maybe just understanding. Maybe some recognition that I wasn't like all these faceless people sitting here. I wasn't one of them. I was more. You know what to do, Rachel said as she put the resume away. I didn't respond. It was clear. I was ready. I was ready to throw away all my old ideas about what life was, what work was, what success was. I was ready to find my way, regardless of other people's expectations. When I left the agency, I felt something in my soul begin to lighten. I didn't know what was waiting for me, but I was no longer the person who sits and waits for a miracle. I realized that a miracle is not something that happens outside. It is something that happens inside us when we decide to live differently. And at that moment, I felt how this change, although not fully conscious, was already beginning to work. Inspired by this feeling, I stepped into a new day, knowing that each next step would be decisive. And although I am still afraid of the future, I am not going to avoid it anymore. I am ready for this challenge. I am ready for changes that will start with me. And if this path is thorny, I will not complain. I will move forward, step by step, because now I understand that each of these steps is my real life.